Welcome to Frank's Self-Love and Self-Empowerment channel. Today I would like to talk about how to deal with these negative emotions, how to deal with these negative thoughts, and how to deal with all that negativity that might be going on in your mind and that might provoke heavy emotions that feel challenging to be with. Yesterday, I met a young girl. She's about 25. I've known her since she has been a little girl, and she wanted to tell me how she's doing. Essentially, she wanted to share how much she's suffering. She said, I have so many emotions inside of me that I don't know how to deal with. And there's so many negative thoughts in my mind that really scare me. I try to push them away. I try not to think these thoughts. But the more I try to push them away, the stronger they become, the more they seem to invade my mind. And eventually it seems to be the only thing I can think about. Exactly that which I try not to think. So I was just listening to her and trying to understand where she is and what's going on in her mind. She even said, I feel so horrible inside. I feel so negative. I feel so down. I feel sometimes I have no self-confidence. I feel I cannot achieve anything. I feel totally overwhelmed by life. I feel like I will not be able to complete my studies. I will not be able to achieve anything in my life. And finally, she even confessed that she's even thinking of committing suicide so that she would no longer have to deal with all this negativity in her own mind. I don't know if you have ever been there in your own life, where you felt inundated with all these negative voices, where you felt overwhelmed by all these heavy negative emotions inside yourself. And you felt truly, excuse my expression, but you felt truly shitty inside, truly miserable. And maybe you felt even despair. Well, I have been there. I have had voices talking in my own head. And essentially these voices are not from somebody else. These are not demons. These have been my own voices. Some voices went back very far into the past, and some voices were more recent. So one thing I try to explain to this girl is that emotions are just emotionally charged energies inside our system. And in order for emotions to transform, we have to become aware of them. And usually what happens when we have so-called negative emotions, we also have negative thoughts which go with these emotions. And what's very important is if you fight a thought or if you fight an emotion inside yourself, if you don't want to look at it, it just goes underground. It doesn't disappear. It just goes down into your unconscious. But sometimes what can happen is that certain thoughts and certain feelings you can no longer repress. It just keeps coming up. Each emotion is like a ping pong ball. And usually with this emotion comes also a thought. And what we don't like, we try to push down. And that's repression. And anything we repress at some point will also come back up. So there's no way that we can keep living a life and keep pushing down all the emotions without having them come up again. And that's what was happening in her life. She said, sometimes I feel like a young girl. I feel I have exactly the same emotions as when I was a young girl. And yes, it's true. Because these are the emotions, these are the thoughts combined with the emotions that come back up from that time. And so how do you deal with that? Well, the first thing that's very important is to start understanding you are much more than just your emotions. Emotions are part of your life experience. You have an emotional body, you have an emotional nature. You have a mental body, you have a mental nature, you have a physical body, a physical nature. But you are much more than your emotions. So when we're challenged by emotions that drag us down, usually what happens is that we are completely identified and enmeshed with these emotions. It's like there's not much of a difference between me and these emotions, between my perception and these emotions. And so what's very important is that you learn to cultivate your observer, that you learn to become aware of what is going on, what's the content of my experience in this moment. And as you learn to cultivate this inner observer, you start also developing a distance between yourself, your inner observer, the one that perceives what is, and the actual content of experience. For example, in this case, tremendous sadness, or fear of the future, or a sense of low self-confidence or low self-esteem. So it's very important that we learn to realize that what we feel and what we think is just an aspect of our experience, but it's not really who we are. Who we are is really the one that perceives life in the outer world and life in the inner world, in the form of thoughts, of emotions, of sensations, of impressions from the outside world, which we process inside. So that's very important to understand. I also use the analogy, imagine you're like the riverbed, that's your consciousness, and the emotions, they kind of flow through this riverbed. But if you fight with the emotions, or you try to repress them or to hide them, then these emotions get stuck. They sort of swirl around, and you might not be aware of that, but sometimes this swirl sucks you in. You sort of become identified with these emotions that trigger a feeling of fear within you or a resistance, because you don't really want to address them, you don't really want to feel them, because you're afraid if you really allow them that they might overwhelm you or, in the worst case, destroy you. But in truth, these emotions will not destroy you. And once you're aware of this emotion, you have developed the inner observer, then you just kind of contain this emotion inside yourself. You just give it the space so that it can be, and within that space you feel it, and through being aware of it and through feeling it, this emotion naturally transforms. And so that's what I try to explain to this young girl, that eventually it's important that she learns to become aware of these emotions, to observe them. She can even write them down so that she can learn to have a bit more distance between the emotion and her awareness, so that she can learn to see, okay, this is the witness in me, the observer, and the other part is the emotion, and that's not the same. And then once she's aware, then she can begin to start feeling this emotion and see what actually happens inside her body as she allows herself to be present, to be aware of this emotion, and to allow it to transform. And so that's important to understand, that emotions eventually do transform when we allow them to be, when we have the observer and then give the emotion the space within which it can be felt. Then any emotion will naturally transform. And that's the fine balance that one needs to understand. It is important that we allow ourselves to have our emotions, to feel them, so that they can transform. And once these, in quotes, negative emotions, no emotion is negative, it's just an emotion, and some we like, some we don't like. The ones we like we call positive emotions, and those we don't like we call negative emotions. But fundamentally, these are all emotions. And so once we have learned more and more to allow these various types of emotions and have allowed them to transform, then we can also begin afterwards to start working with our mindset. We can begin to observe, what is it that I'm thinking? What are these thoughts that provoke these sort of negative emotions? And then we can begin to ask ourselves, do I really still want to believe that? Do I really still want to believe that I'm not capable, that I will never succeed, that I'm not good enough, that I made a mistake and that I should feel guilty? So once your emotions are balanced, then it's very important that you can begin to address the mental aspect, that you can begin to observe your thoughts, that you can begin to identify the belief system, the attitudes, the opinions, the convictions that you hold in your mind and that keep producing these negative conversations in your mind, this negative self-talk, or some people like to call it these demons in your head. Essentially, these demons are nothing else than old records, old recordings that keep playing. And since these are negative recordings, we call them demons. But essentially, these are just negative beliefs, negative attitudes, negative opinions, negative convictions that you have learned about yourself. And once you are aware of them, then you can begin to rewrite these programs and to replace them by more positive, more loving, and more self-empowering programs. For example, you look at your thoughts and you feel, I'm not good enough. I'm really not good enough. I'm not okay the way I am. I'm not beautiful enough. I'm not intelligent enough. I'm not rich enough. I'm not successful enough. So you just identify these thoughts. And of course, if you keep thinking that more or less unconsciously throughout the day, it will affect your state, your emotional state. You will feel miserable, you will feel low, you will feel inadequate, and essentially you will feel a lack of self-confidence, self-worth, and self-esteem. And that's why it's important to address these thoughts and to begin to rewrite them, in this case by saying, I am good enough. I love myself the way I am. I am okay the way I am. And once you're aware of these negative beliefs and have created these positive ones, then you can start applying these positive affirmations throughout the day. Ideally, already in the morning when you wake up, you start reading this list that says, I am good enough. I love myself. I deserve to be happy. And this you can do with any kind of thought, with any kind of belief. And as you keep going, eventually, as you write a new record, a more positive record, then there will be a much more positive, a much more loving, and a much more self-empowering voice in your head that speaks to yourself, especially in moments when you feel challenged, especially in moments when you might be facing a certain hardship, especially in moments when you feel stressed and need help and support to come back to center. And so these are all the things that I explained to this young girl, and she said, well, this sounds like you can't just do that in a few minutes or in a day or two or in a week. I said, you're right. That's a lifelong process. And that's why loving yourself is a cultivation. And that's why cultivating the art of self-love is a lifelong process. And if you really would like to know more, how to create this inner container, how to love yourself in a conscious and loving way, independent of what the actual content of experience is, if it's sadness, fear, anger, jealousy, greed, guilt, or whatever it is, it doesn't matter. you can learn to relate to any of these experiences in a conscious and loving way. You can learn to welcome these experiences one content at a time and to allow it to be, so that these experiences can transform, that they can harmonize and eventually be neutralized, and so that you can be present again. And if you would like to know how, then I recommend that you look at my book. I have a link below. It's called The Art of Self-Love. And the subtitle is Loving Yourself is the Key to Happiness. And in this book, I describe step by step how you can learn to relate to all of your experiences one at a time in a conscious and loving way. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you again. Take good care. Bye bye.